Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the fourth weekend of March 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news. Today, we'll hear about President Trump's executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. We'll look at the cost of the SpaceX mission to recover 2 stranded astronauts, and we'll discuss the legal responses to the Trump administration's deportation efforts. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on President Trump's executive order to dismantle the Department of Education, it's our Dan McCaleb.
As he vowed during his campaign for president and after taking office, President Donald Trump on Thursday signed an executive order to begin dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. What does that mean, and how will it impact state education departments and local schools? Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, let's start with Trump's actions. What did he do on Thursday?
Yeah, he fulfilled a long-awaited campaign promise, something conservatives, not all Republicans, but conservatives have been talking about, dreaming about, promising for a long time. That is dismantling the Department of Education. Now, to be clear, Trump does not have the legal authority to outright abolish it. The Department of Education was created by Congress, by law, and so he can't just, with a stroke of a pen, totally destroy the agency. He's tried to do that with others and already been rebuffed by the courts. But this does dismantle it. Trump has claimed that he'll cut the spending on the Department of Education in half. So that gives you an idea of the scope that he's expecting this to do. And so, we can talk about the implications of this. The Department of Education is a vast bureaucratic apparatus that oversees a lot of different things, but a lot of critics of the Department of Education have said, well, a lot of the most important things that the Department of Education does could just be moved to other agencies, while a lot of the bureaucratic, nonsense that they do, could be just ended. So for instance, you might think of school lunches, but that's actually the U.S. Department of Agriculture handles that, not the Department of Education. You might think of all the student loans and grant funding. And, that's a good question that would impact a lot of Americans if their student loans are somehow affected, or their Pell Grants. But the Treasury Department could theoretically handle that. I mean, if you're just making payments on a loan, does that, couldn't you just pay the Treasury Department like the way you pay your taxes? And then, there's other things like the civil rights investigation. So, if there's problems on campuses, the Department of Education has a team that investigates it, but could the Department of Justice theoretically do that? And so what you learn as you look more and more into the Department of Education is it doesn't spend a lot of time actually educating anyone. It doesn't set curriculums. It doesn't hire or pay teachers. It doesn't really do much educating at all. It handles a lot of bureaucratic different programs. It distributes grants for different things, but ultimately education is handled at the state level. Now, with that being said, this move is really controversial. It cannot be fully fulfilled without lawmakers in Congress getting behind it. And right now, I don't think Trump's going to be able to get the votes in the Senate to make that happen.
Casey, taking the entire history of the United States into the equation, factoring it in, we're going to celebrate our 250th anniversary as a country next year. The Department of Education isn't all that old. In fact, it's really...
You're older than the Department of Education.
Yes, I am. It was created under the Jimmy Carter administration in 1979. Since then, it has spent more than $3 trillion in taxpayer money on various initiatives. In signing the order, one of the things Trump emphasized was that student outcomes aren't any better today than they were when the department was created. In fact, we trail most countries when it comes to education outcomes. So it's the agency has spent $3 trillion since 1979. Trump says, that it's not accomplishing anything. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, we do go near the bottom of the list for developed nations, of course, not the whole world, but for developed nation economies, we're pretty low and we spend more than anyone. He's right about that. It's definitely an indictment of the education system in the U.S. And, there's a lot of questions about why is that? We can spend a lot of time talking about why is that, but it's probably more useful for this conversation to say, how do you fix those problems and who's more likely to fix it? Let's say, students are struggling in a Dayton, Ohio, school district and the math scores are low. Now, who's going to be able to better fix that? A local school board member, local, parents board, maybe a local state, like Ohio State Commission that's tasked with these kind of things, or a team of like Ivy League bureaucrats who live down the street from me here in the DC area. It's just kind of like who, make all this money. What do they know about, what was happening in Dayton, Ohio? And do they actually spend any time helping these students? And I think it actually creates this problem, an accountability problem, because, I don't know if you've ever been on a team, Dan, where you have like more than one person in charge of something. If you have like maybe 3 or 4 people in charge, what happens is everybody kind of expects other people to solve the problem. So the state leaders look to the federal government, the Department of Education, expect them to fix the problem. And the Department of Education is not going to fix it. And they say, well, education is the state's issue. They handle most of that. And so the buck keeps getting passed back and forth between them, and no one ever actually has to take the blame for why things are going poorly. Because if you blame the Department of Education, you can say, well, it's a state's issue. You blame the states to say, well, we need more funding from the Department of Education. And, maybe they do. The Department of Education has taken trillions of dollars over these decades and little to show for it. But all that being said, I don't think the average American really knows the ins and outs of the Department of Education, and generally cutting education funding, I think, is a hard sell for people who are politically disengaged and don't understand what the Department of Education actually does. It just sounds bad. Do you want to cut education funding? Well, as a gut reflex, probably not. Education's important. So you're going to have to know a level of detail and the complexity of the situation to support it. So I think that's why it's a hard sell, for politically. And the polling shows that Americans are kind of skeptical of the idea.
One of the biggest concerns, and we're almost out of time here, Casey, one of the biggest concerns from states and local school districts was that, the federal government helps fund particularly rural school districts, lower income school districts, funds programs for children with special disabilities and special needs. Trump said that funding is going to remain fully intact. So I don't know if that alleviates any concerns or not, but final word, Casey.
Yeah, he said that all the, quote, critical functions of the U.S. or the U.S. Department of Education will remain intact. I guess they get to decide what that means. So, yeah, I think a lot of the things that would be most controversial to get rid of are going to stay there. I mean, you could ask on a macro level, why does the money have to go all the way to D.C. to get sent back to Dayton, Ohio? Why can't it? Maybe it just needs to go to the State House in Ohio and then sent back to Dayton or whichever city it may be. But for now, I don't think we're going to fix that problem or that question, as the federal government continues to go trillions of dollars into debt. That is also last thing, Dan, as we close up is, there's going to be legal challenges to this as well. I'm sure every turn Trump is facing, legal challenges, and this won't be any different.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the mission to recover 2 astronauts, it's John Stife.
Elon Musk's SpaceX was called in to essentially rescue a space mission or 2 astronauts who were stuck at the International Space Station. I'm here with the Center Square regional editor, Steve Wilson. Steve, can you tell me why the U.S. decided to go outside of NASA to figure this problem out and why it didn't happen earlier?
The astronauts that were up there that were stranded, they were testing the Dreamliner spacecraft, which is manufactured by Boeing, and there was a problem with the spacecraft's propulsion system. And it was only supposed to be kind of like Gilligan's Island, an 8-hour tour. But it turns out that this turned into a 268-day mission that they just ended up integrating them into the crew of the ISS. And what happened was there was all this political wrangling about it. Elon says the Biden administration rejected his offer to go rescue the astronauts. They say that's not the case. The astronauts say that there was no political issues involved with it, with having them up there, and that they weren't stranded. But to me, it's just not a good look for our nation's space agency, especially when the nation is grappling with $36 trillion in debt.
Steve, what do you think the takeaway is for the future of NASA and kind of this U.S. space program in general? We've seen a lot of privatized moves towards, I guess, being better at it than the U.S. And what do you think goals are in the future for NASA?
I think the problem with NASA right now is, I remember NASA was an aspirational thing. There was always a great mission that they were working on. You obviously had John F. Kennedy, who famously said, by the end of the decade, we will put a man on the moon. And guess what? We did it. Then we built Skylab, which is fascinating, the first space station. Then we started to build the space shuttle. The space shuttle was my generational aspirational thing. I remember watching the first space shuttle launch and just being mesmerized. And obviously the Challenger, the Columbia disasters, that's been a definitely hurt NASA. But I think the thing that's hurt NASA the most is, what are they going to do? What is that one singular thing that people can get behind and say, you know, we ought to spend billions of dollars on this because it's good for mankind? I don't see that now. I mean, you look at the Boeing Starliner spacecraft. The Boeing company took a more than $500 million loss on that craft. And in addition to their problems with the 737 MAX commercial aircraft, the KC-46 tanker, Boeing investors have just taken a bath. And you just have to wonder what's going to happen next. I think the administration needs to come up with a coherent plan and give people a reason to, I hate to use a cliche, reach for the stars.
Steve, one of the things we always focus on are the taxpayer dollars involved in something like this. And you brought up all the debt the federal government's in. And we're talking about missions that what Reuters estimated it was 100 million to 150 million for the SpaceX trip to even occur. One of the reasons they didn't go get those astronauts right away, that they said, were the costs involved. How much is all of this costing, and what's the value for?
See, that's the thing. It's a good point you brought that up, because one of the things that was great about the space program is there were so many technologies that filter down to the consumer level. You think about the microelectronics revolution. You think about advances in materials like Mylar. Now, I'm not going to say Tang was an advance because that stuff is nasty. But anyway, the thing that I find fascinating is we just don't have that technological bleed down to consumers now. Elon has done a great job with developing with SpaceX and their Dragon, which holds 7 people. That's a lot of people to put in one space capsule. But the thing is, I think what they need to do is figure out a way to get the public just captured by the lure of space travel. But Mars, you think about, it would probably cost $1 trillion to send people to Mars.
When you look at putting Elon, who's obviously in charge of certain things with the federal government right now with Doge, when you pay his company money in order to do something like this, is it literally that he's the only one that had that technology that could do it? Or is there something nefarious going on with him getting a bunch of money and his company being involved? Like,
I think a lot of people could really look at this and say that, well, Elon's tight with the president. Of course, they're going to go to him. They're not going to go to, say, Jeff Bezos and, his Blue Origin company, which, that would be fair. But I think the thing is it just, for me, it's not a good look. The fact that Trump and Elon are so tight and interconnected. It's just, to me, it's not a good look. And I think it's getting to be harder to justify, considering that like I said, we're $36 trillion in debt, pouring billions into a NASA that just, it isn't what it once was. All those great engineers and scientists, where are the next generation? The thing is, when I was a kid, the coolest thing that you wanted to grow up to be was either the president of the United States or an astronaut. And I just don't think kids now want to be an astronaut, and that's a shame.
What do you think's next in this? I know that they're going to do more trial missions of Boeing, but what do you think?
I think that NASA's, from what I saw at the news conference the other day, I think they're going to stick with the Dreamliner, even though, in the way it works, we're not taking that loss. Boeing, because I think it's a cost plus contract. Don't correct me if I'm wrong. They have to eat the losses on it. And like I said, their investors have taken a beating over it because the thing has a lot of problems. And it's just crazy to think that these space capsules, which were really no more different than what happened in the 60s, we can't build that anymore. And we can't build it reliably. And I think part of that too, I don't know if you remember back in at the end of the Cold War, when Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense, he had what they called the Last Supper, where he literally sat all the defense contractors in there and he said, the contracts of the good old days are gone. You either combine or you die. And what happened was we're down to like 3 companies now. Because you used to have McDonnell Douglas, you used to have Vought, you used to have Grumman before it combined with Northrop Grumman. Now you got 3 companies. And you don't have the competition. And I mean, granted, Elon and Jeff Bezos are trying to add some competition to that, but I think the future of NASA is actually commercial space. I think those guys have figured out a way to get there, and they've got the money to do it, and they've got the want to. And I just don't see the want to on the government side.
Steve, thanks again. Always appreciate your insight. You can follow along with this story at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to John and Steve. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the Trump administration's deportation efforts. It's our Dan McCaleb.
The Trump administration's effort to deport thousands of violent foreign nationals in the U.S. illegally hit some legal snags in the past week when a federal judge in Washington, D.C. ruled that the deportation of Venezuelan prison gang members be temporarily halted. 3 planes carrying more than 200 violent illegal aliens had already entered international waters on their way to El Salvador, and the Trump administration did not order them to return to the U.S. Later, Trump said the judge who ordered the deportations be halted should be impeached, which led to a rebuke from U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Roberts. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, voters elected Trump in part on his promises to secure the border and remove violent criminal aliens. But now Democrat-appointed judges are working against him. Tell us more.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story. I mean, there's a whole constitutional question, a legal question. Who has the authority to do what? Did Trump violate a court order? Is this judge acting outside of his constitutional authority? But before we dive into all that, I think if you have to have a constitutional crisis, this is the best possible thing to have a crisis over for the Trump administration. This is not Trump trying to dismantle the Department of Education or even USAID or any of these other things that are more controversial. He's deporting violent gang members that are in the country illegally. And so I think just from the political angle, this is where you want to have this fight. If you're on the Trump team, he's, found these gang members who in the U.S., they're known for being violent, very organized criminal operation, and he's getting them out of the U.S. And so this kind of just interesting that this is the hill that the judges are trying to die on. We're seeing this pattern play out, though, with the judges across all kinds of different issues. Pretty much everything Trump has done via executive order has been challenged by lawsuits and then brought into court. And Trump is generally losing these battles right now, actually. So that's why what John Roberts said is so interesting, because all these things are probably going to go to the Supreme Court. I mean, these are such unique cases, whether it's, USAID, defunding USAID, or it is deporting these judges, or it is banning transgender people from the military. That's also being challenged in court. These all probably going to make their way up to the Supreme Court. So getting a little unusual window into what John Roberts thinks is very helpful. It's very informative because ultimately he's going to be possibly the deciding vote on a lot of these big cases.
Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, had a roundtable meeting with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis yesterday. And he just pretty much said that these Democrat appointed judges, aren't going to stop us from making this country safe again. I mean, this sounds like there could be a big battle coming up between the Trump administration and the judicial system in this country. Doesn't the Supreme Court really need to get involved sooner rather than later?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, this is unusual in modern history, but in American history, it's not at all unusual. I mean, there's a whole constitutional history here over exactly how much power the courts have. Basically, the Supreme Court ruled in the early 1800s in Marbury v. Madison that it has the authority for judicial review. And it has the authority to basically say that what Congress did or what the president did was unconstitutional. And that power is not in the Constitution. I think it's important for people to understand that is not explicitly written in the Constitution. The Supreme Court granted itself that power in Marbury v. Madison and set that precedent. Now, since then, we've generally obeyed that precedent, and it would be probably one of the biggest changes in American history if we undid that precedent, to be clear. But that is a power that the Supreme Court granted itself. Now, what's interesting here there's a difference between the Supreme Court saying you can't do something versus you have to do something. And that's where I think we're getting into the really dicey waters here, where the court may be overstepping its authority, whether it's this, district court judges or eventually the Supreme Court. So if Congress passes a law, the Supreme Court can say that law is not constitutional. But they're not supposed to rewrite the law. Or, if the president deports someone, the judge, in this case, in this El Salvadoran case said, what you did was unconstitutional. But then this judge went further and said that flight needs to turn around and come home. Now, does the judge has the authority to rule that something is not constitutional, but does he have the authority to tell the president of the United States to do something proactively, like turn a plane around that's already in the air and possibly international waters? That's where I think the lines are getting blurred. And the Supreme Court, I think actually the courts in recent years have sort of overstepped their authority. For instance, John Roberts, who we're talking about, he sort of rewrote Obamacare. When Obamacare got to the Supreme Court, everyone was waiting on pins and needles to see if it was going to be ruled constitutional or not. And the big thing in question was whether you can charge people a fine for not buying health insurance. And all of Obamacare really needed that to work. And then they basically, John Roberts and a few others reinterpreted the law in a way that was favorable enough to keep it. And they sort of redefined what the law meant so that it could stay. And I think that's a great example. I think you actually saw the same thing with gay marriage. They just felt, if you read that case, they felt that they had a moral obligation to allow gay marriage, and they didn't really point to the laws or the legal arguments. They just pointed to moral arguments. And so you've seen in recent years, the Supreme Court's gotten more and more bold in not just saying this is constitutional or this is not constitutional, but in saying here's what needs to happen in America. And I think they've sort of become a new legislative branch because Congress has become so dysfunctional and so divided they can't get anything done.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How will one Washington state bill impact parental rights in education? Why is Wisconsin changing how it rates school districts? And when is it the best time to list your home? We'll have all that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The nation's top prosecutor announced federal charges against 3 people for their respective roles in attacks on Tesla property. Tesla cars, showrooms, lots, and dealerships have become targets for those frustrated with Elon Musk's effort to reshape the federal government under the direction of President Donald Trump. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced federal charges against 3 people on Thursday for specific attacks on Tesla properties. All 3 people attempted to use Molotov cocktails to set fire to Tesla cars and charging stations. A Republican lawmaker is demanding that the man responsible for leaking President Donald Trump's tax returns in 2019 testify before the House Judiciary Committee. Responsible for one of the largest data breaks in the history of the Internal Revenue Service, the ex-IRS contractor Charles Littlejohn is currently serving a 5-year prison sentence for leaking the tax documents of roughly 400,000 wealthy Americans, including Trump and Doge leader Elon Musk, to media outlets in 2019 and 2020. Littlejohn's short sentence results from the DOJ charging him with only one count of unauthorized disclosure of tax information and then offering a plea deal, which Republicans blasted as too lenient. A pair of congressmen are opening an investigation into the military's use of airspace in the national capital region in response to January's deadly air tragedy that claimed the lives of 67 people. 2 representatives penned a letter to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth requesting a member-level briefing on the circumstances surrounding the January 29th collision between an Army helicopter and an American Airlines jet over the Potomac River. The lawmakers want to know what measures the military is taking to ensure nothing like this happens again. America's natural gas industry celebrated this week after President Donald Trump signed into law a resolution repealing Biden-era fees on methane emissions. The waste emissions charge, which Republicans say is the equivalent of a natural gas tax, was authorized by the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act and implemented by the Environmental Protection Agency in November 2024. The resolution rescinds that regulation under the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act gives Congress the authority to repeal regulations issued during the final months of a previous administration. Energy experts who testified before Congress in February said the high energy prices during Joe Biden's presidency directly resulted from environmental regulations on energy production. A new analysis from the conservative MacIver Institute puts the taxpayer savings from Wisconsin's Act 10 at $35.6 billion. Act 10, which curtailed public employee unions' collective bargaining rights, has shaped the state's tax burden for over a decade. MacIver says this figure only captures part of the law's impact, as it also gave local governments more flexibility to manage finances efficiently instead of being bound by union contracts. While those additional savings are difficult to quantify, the law's future is now uncertain as it challenges before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. On April 1st, voters will decide between conservative Judge Brad Schimmel and liberal Judge Susan Crawford, an election that could determine whether the court maintains its liberal majority or shifts back to conservative control, potentially affecting Act 10's fate. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on controversial legislation in Washington State about school safety and parental rights, it's our TJ Martinell.
Here with me is Curling Johnson, and we're going to be discussing a parental rights law that some feel is under attack by the state legislature after they passed it last year. Carlene, tell me a little bit about what the situation is in the legislature right now.
Yeah, this still seems to be the dominant controversial measure of this session. I can tell you that. And I attended on Thursday late morning another hearing on second substitute House Bill 1296 to essentially remove many of the parental rights that were guaranteed by Initiative 2081. Now, folks may or may not recall, but this was an initiative that was filed by Let's Go Washington, signed by more than, I think, 440,000 Washingtonians, basically to say, okay, schools, you're not going to hide what's going on with my kids from me. If my child is coming to you and wants some kind of medical procedure or is talking about gender confusion or mental health issues, you're going to tell me, the parent. So that was kind of the backdrop for 2081. It went to the legislature. They adopted it and signed it into law, but subsequently have come back this year with Senate Bill 5181 and HB 1276. So two kind of, companion bills, if you will, that have moved through their chambers, both passed off the Senate and House. Now they've gone to the opposite chamber for consideration. So the hearing on Thursday was again over 1296. And TJ, there were at least a few dozen people signed in person to testify, many others to testify remotely. And by and large, they were there in opposition to the bill to say, leave 2181 in place. Don't gut the Parents' Bill of Rights. But the testimony certainly didn't reflect that. There were more people testifying or given the opportunity to testify by the chair, Senator Lisa Wellman, in support of the bill than those that were in opposition. So you had lots of rumblings. The hearing was a bit contentious and ended with a lot of people kind of throwing their hands up saying, why did I drive all the way here to testify and you don't even give me a chance?
So just to keep track of where we're at, voters signed an initiative in the law or the legislature adopted it. And then it's turning around and trying to undermine it, as the critics would say. What exactly does the bill do, and how does that fundamentally undermine the initiative that was passed?
Right. Among the biggest changes in it, and Representative Monica Stonier is the sponsor, the prime sponsor of HB 1296. And she, in the hearing on Thursday, as she's said in other hearings on her bill, said this is about protecting student rights. So her bill is she contends more of a balance for student rights. And they say this aligns with federal protections for children. So that, let's say, and this example came up in testimony on Thursday, you got a student who's confused about their gender, but they don't feel comfortable talking to their parents. The contention of the sponsor is that these kids need a safe place to go to school, whether it's a teacher they trust or the counselor at school, to go and say, these are my questions, and will you facilitate my further education of these issues? Parents are saying, wait a minute, if my kid is coming to you with something that's that big of a deal that they might subsequently start taking hormone blockers or talking to people about potential, gender altering surgeries and other procedures, I would want to know that as a parent. So that's been the argument of folks pushing back, saying this was the whole reason we put the Parents' Bill of Rights into place. And now the attempt here is to undo it. And the supporters of the bill say we need to protect students, and they contend you can balance that with parents' rights at the same time.
So why has this become such a high priority for the majority party in the state legislature? What are they arguing or making the case for this on terms of, why they need to pass this new law?
Well, that's a good question. I would argue, based on even some of the testimony I heard in the hearing on Thursday, that you've got the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction under Superintendent Chris Rakedahl asking for this legislation. And he sent a staff member to testify in support of the bill on Thursday. Basically, he says, we hope we don't have to enforce this, but written into the bill, it gives OSPI the authority to crack down on these school districts that fail to comply. Say they, a student went to a teacher or a counselor and said, I'm confused about my gender. Will you help me get some advice and don't tell my parents? And say it's a more conservative school district. And that school district said, well, we think your parents should probably know what's going on. In that case, OSPI could crack down on that teacher, that counselor, whatever, not certify them the next time they came up, and potentially, have other consequences against the school district for not complying if, assuming 1296 or 5181 is signed into law. So OSPI has asked for this. They're the ones that told school districts, all 295 public school districts across the state, not to comply after 2081 took effect. So they're the ones who are asking for this and supporting it, along with the Washington Education Association, of course, a very powerful, state teachers lobby. So this fight is going to go, I can guarantee you, TJ, to probably the last couple of days of this session. This has been the ugliest thing, the most emotionally charged hearings I've sat in during the session. And it's only, I sense it only intensifying.
Thanks, Caroline, for talking about it. Viewers can keep up on our work at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, TJ and Carlene. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on Wisconsin school report cards, It's our Eliana Kernodle.
A bill that would change the academic standards used on Wisconsin's state report cards back to prior levels passed the Senate and is now headed to Governor Tony Evers. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's John Stife. John, when did these academic standards change and why?
So it started to change in the 2020-2021 school year. There hasn't really been a good reason given other than post-COVID, there were scores that got lower. And so the person in charge of that, the DPI superintendent, decided, hey, we're going to change where the different marks are for, whether a school district gets 2 stars, 3 stars, or 4 stars, in order to lower those standards rather than pressure the schools to do better and the students to have higher standards that meet the federal standards for those tests.
And there's been some speculation about political motives for doing this. Can you tell us more about kind of what people suspect of the superintendent?
Well, on April 1st, there's an election for the DPI superintendent role. And Jill Underly, who currently has the role, is running against Brittany Kinzer, who's from Milwaukee, originally was a special education teacher in the Chicago area, and then worked in Milwaukee and has been part of a nonprofit in Milwaukee since then. And Kinzer's been really big on, hey, we need to have higher standards. We need to be able to compare the data with other states. We need to, rather than lowering in its math, writing, and reading that's really in question, rather than lowering those standards, they want to have higher standards and want to have higher standards for the schools, and they want to be able to look at that and say, okay, we need more funding in these areas in order to get us back at where those standards were pre-COVID.
But now this legislature is trying to address this problem. What are they doing?
So the problem that it's mainly Republican legislators had with this was that this wasn't something that was done publicly. It wasn't something that was said out loud when it changed. It's like minor rulemaking things that happen in committees. And the DPI superintendent never showed up to these committees to explain. It was never pointed out, hey, these things have changed. Instead, people had to figure out on their own, like, wait a minute, why is 3 stars now different for a public school than it was previously? Why have all these things changed? And then they went back and looked at the explanation each year that came in the rules and figured out, oh, they lowered the standards on each of these. So now the data is not comparable with other states. So the point of the legislation is, okay, we're going to bring things back to where those standards were in 2019. We can have comparable data. We know that more schools are going to get bad marks then. And that's okay, because then we know what we have to fix rather than kind of giving these inflated estimates of how schools are doing and saying, oh, patting them on the back and saying you're doing a good job. They want to be able to look at, okay, which areas are problems. And one of the larger problems in the state of Wisconsin, like a lot of states, is that in places like Milwaukee, there's a gap between different socioeconomic groups, different races, different areas of the school district in performance. So they want to be able to pointedly address those things. And that's where Kinzer is from, the Milwaukee area. So she knows those issues very well.
And has there been any critiques of the current superintendent and questions of why she's doing what she's doing?
Yeah, there have been a lot of critiques of her. And it's not just from Republican legislators, because those Republicans are pushing this bill, keep pointing to the fact that Governor Evers has also said this was probably a mistake. We shouldn't have done this. And the big question now becomes, okay, is he going to sign this bill? Is he going to do it before the election? How is this going to go down, and what's going to be the appearance of it when he does take action on it?
And it's not like this is a insignificant political role that she holds. Tony Evers, he used to have this position as superintendent, right?
Right. And so she is an important kind of political position heading forward, because Evers, after this election, after actually not the election, but after the budgeting process goes through, he's going to say whether he's going to run again. And she may be one of the people that try to run for governor when he doesn't. And not only that, but the DPI is a huge part of the state's budget, and it's going to be an increasing factor. As we've discussed a lot previously, this is the funding for the schools are what have led to all these ballot initiatives in Wisconsin. And this funding is up and the student base is down, and the number of teachers and administrators in the state aren't necessarily down by the same percentage that students are. So funding in the public schools is going to continue to be an issue on whether they really need a lot more funding or whether they're spending it appropriately, and how that works with the local tax bases as the student populations change in so much of the state, because Wisconsin is one place where the projections for what the population is going to look like in the future for a large portion of the state is it's going to go down. There's going to be a lot less students in a lot of areas, especially rural areas, maybe less so in like the Madison area and the Milwaukee area. But throughout the rest of the state, there's going to be less students. So it's like, how do you guide those public schools to appropriately spend money and staff when that occurs?
Well, John, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and John. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the seasonality of listing your home for sale is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divangi. There are nuances to the business, and in terms of like actually home buying and home listing, we're in March. I think a lot of people who are thinking about selling, of course, the market is causing people to maybe waver a little bit one way or the other on the buy or the sell side. But it's May, and in particular late May, that is historically the best time to actually list. And so for people who are thinking about, making it happen in 2025 on the sell side, now would be about the time that you'd want to start to put the things in motion to get your house ready so that you could potentially list it at high tide. Why, though, is late May the sweet spot for this business?
I mean, lately it's been, first of all, there's the weather, right? The weather is like beautiful. In the past, people used to get the kids in the van and they used to drive around on a Saturday looking at housing, and you had all these open houses. It was a beautiful thing. And until they found the one, right? And so nowadays technology is wonderful because at least we have Zillow. Yeah. You go online. We got 3D we got 3D tours. We got virtual tours. We got, all kinds of gadgets. We can see every room, and it's really cool. We get immersive. We have immersive experiences now from our sofa without having to get in the van. But that's the reason. That's one of the main reasons. It used to be the hotter, the spring comes around and you get to springtime and almost summer, and the weather's nice. And so you go out and look at housing. Also, another reason is, most people want to buy to get their kids registered for school, right? Before the new school year starts. And so you go out and buy housing, hopefully early spring, late winter, early spring, so that you can get the kids in the new school when the school starts. I'm actually going through that process right now.
And let's talk about that. What's it like? I mean, you're moving a lot of pieces around to try to make it work with your family. I mean, how have you structurally sort of set up the way that you're going about buying a home at this point? And you're moving not just like to the next town over. You are looking to move
across the country,
right? And so for people who are doing that, like, what are the things that you've had to think about? And then I want to ask you about, what have the realities of your search been like?
Yeah, no, I mean, the first thing first is if you have to sell a house, you have to contact an agent right away. to get the agent to tell you, to help you, right? Help you with, it's nice to have a little walkthrough, make sure that your house is in the condition, that you wanted to extract the most dollars for your home, right? One of the things I tell people is make sure you start with improving your online curb appeal. Make sure that you have the best pictures for your home. The other thing is the front yard and backyard really matter. People pull up to the house. They want to see it. They're going to see it. If it doesn't look good, if you got tall grass, you got a problem. Got to fix that. There are other rooms in the house that need to be fixed usually. First, paint. It's very cheap. Make sure you paint the place over, make it look brand new. Kitchen and bathrooms. Very important, right? So those are little things that you have to do, that you should do, in order to list your home and be successful. The other thing is the best time to list your home actually varies widely across metro areas.
Well, let's talk about that. Cause I mean so in general, late May is kind of the sweet spot. However, are there markets that are just, I don't know, some markets seem to be like moving very quickly. Some markets seem to be moving very slowly. It does not have necessarily a whole lot to do with geography.
It does. It has a lot to do with the sun and the number of sunny days, right? So like you have markets like Phoenix that are super hot all the time.
Yeah.
Like nobody wants to be outside, right? Nobody's going to be looking at houses in Phoenix in the summertime, right? The best time to list your home to extract the biggest premium in Phoenix is actually late November, December when things are cooler, right? And so it just varies a lot. And the number of sunny days tend to have a lot to do with it. Now, in the past few years, the volatility in mortgage rates, the big fluctuations in mortgages have also played an important role in the timing, because ultimately the best timing to basically extract the most dollars for your sale, right? And so, when mortgages dropped, well, you had a big influx of buyers. When mortgages went up, buyers pulled back. This past month, for example, we're seeing that both sellers and buyers are pulling back a little bit. A lot of it has to do with policy uncertainty. A lot of it has to do with all the kind of the fear in the news media, with the stock market not doing so well, lately, right? And so all of these factors are going to play a role. But traditionally, places like Austin, San Diego, San Jose, Seattle, homes listed in March yielded the largest windfall, right? Got higher than,
which is now, just FYI. That's like, exactly. If you're in one of those markets and you want to move, list it.
Do it now.
Yeah,
exactly. Do it now. And then, you got markets where it's a little bit later in the year. Like Baltimore is going to be in June, and Indianapolis is going to be in June. San Francisco is actually a little bit is in April. And then I mentioned Phoenix, right? Tampa and Phoenix, October, November. So you're later in the year, when things cool down a little bit is what we're seeing.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.